are rerouting flights in West Asia. Thousands of passengers have been stranded around the world. African travelers, too, have been caught in the conflict.
Iran has launched retaliatory strikes on United States military bases across the Gulf, dramatically escalating the confrontation and sending shockwaves across the region. Military developments have dominated the headlines, but another crisis began unfolding almost immediately in a completely different space: the global aviation network. The consequences are now reaching Africa. Many long-distance routes connecting African cities to Europe, Asia, and North America pass directly through Gulf air corridors or depend on major transit hubs in the region. As those skies become more restricted and airport operations are disrupted, airlines are forced to delay, reroute, or cancel flights. For thousands of African travelers and airlines, what began as a military escalation is now turning into a sudden aviation crisis. So, will traveling for Africans get completely restricted? Let's find out. The moment tensions exploded in West Asia, most headlines immediately focused on the military side of the story. Missiles, retaliation, and geopolitical warnings dominated the news cycle. But inside the aviation world, something else began unfolding almost instantly. Something that would quietly ripple across continents and land directly on Africa's doorstep. Commercial aviation operates on extremely precise planning. Aircraft follow fixed corridors through the sky, carefully coordinated between countries. These corridors are designed to keep thousands of aircraft moving safely every single day. But the moment military activity enters that same airspace, everything changes. When Iran launched retaliatory strikes targeting United States military bases across the Gulf region, aviation authorities had to react within minutes. Passenger aircraft cannot risk flying through areas where missiles, military aircraft, or air defense systems could suddenly appear. Even the possibility of misidentification or accidental interception is considered too dangerous. As a result, several countries across the region quickly began restricting their airspace. Iraq, Syria, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates introduced partial or complete closures of their skies. These decisions were not political gestures. They were safety measures designed to prevent civilian aircraft from entering zones where military operations might occur. But airspace closures do not remain contained inside national borders. Modern flight routes cross multiple countries in sequence, especially along the corridors linking Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. When even one section of that corridor becomes unavailable, airlines must immediately redesign entire routes. Flights that were already in the air suddenly needed new paths. Aircraft preparing for departure were held on the ground. Some journeys became too long or too complex to operate safely. Others lost their landing options because airports in the region were also facing operational disruption. This is how a regional military event quickly transformed into a global aviation shock. Within hours, airlines around the world began canceling or delaying flights as they attempted to understand the new airspace restrictions. Aircraft schedules that had been planned weeks in advance suddenly had to be rewritten in real time. Crews, fuel calculations, airport slots, and passenger connections all had to be reconsidered at once. For Africa, the impact was immediate. Many long-distance flights departing from African cities rely on routes that pass directly through the Gulf region before continuing toward Europe or Asia. Those skies act as a bridge between continents. When the bridge closes, aircraft cannot simply continue as planned. Airlines must divert flights around the restricted zones, which often adds hundreds or even thousands of kilometers to a journey. In some cases, the diversion becomes so large that the flight is no longer practical to operate. Passengers waiting to depart from African airports suddenly found themselves facing delays without clear explanations. Others who had already begun their journeys discovered that connecting flights would no longer exist by the time they landed. What began as a military escalation thousands of kilometers away had now become something much closer to home for African travelers. But the next question reveals an even deeper layer of the story. Why do disruptions in Gulf airspace affect African travel so quickly and so severely? The reason the shock reached Africa so quickly lies in how global aviation has been structured over the past 2 decades. Modern air travel no longer functions as a simple point-to-point system. Instead, it operates through powerful transit hubs, massive airports designed to collect passengers from dozens of countries and redistribute them across the world. For Africa, some of the most important of these hubs sit in the Gulf. Cities such as Dubai, Doha, and Kuwait have quietly become the crossroads of international travel for millions of African passengers. A traveler leaving Lagos, Nairobi, Accra, Addis Ababa, or Johannesburg often does not fly directly to their final destination in Europe, Asia, or North America. Instead, they pass through one of these Gulf gateways before continuing their journey. This system works because it is efficient. Gulf airports operate around the clock, connecting hundreds of routes with tightly coordinated schedules. A passenger arriving from Africa can land in Dubai and within hours board another aircraft heading to London, Beijing, Mumbai, or New York. Airlines have built entire business models around this hub structure, but that same efficiency creates vulnerability. When one of those hubs is disrupted, the ripple spreads instantly across every route connected to it. Aircraft arriving from Africa cannot proceed if onward flights are canceled. Passengers who were meant to transfer suddenly have nowhere to go. Airlines must decide whether to delay departures, hold aircraft on the ground, or cancel entire journeys. And this is exactly what began happening once the conflict escalated. Reports began emerging that key airports in the region, including Dubai International Airport and Kuwait's main aviation hub, were experiencing operational shutdowns and disruptions following the strikes. Even limited interruptions at airports of that scale can shake the entire system, because those airports move enormous volumes of passengers every single day. Dubai alone normally handles tens of millions of international travelers each year. A large portion of those travelers come from or are heading toward African destinations. When operations slow or stop at such airports, the consequences travel far beyond the Gulf itself. Aircraft waiting to land must circle or divert. Flights scheduled to depart cannot push back from the gate. Crews run out of duty hours while waiting for instructions. Passengers trying to connect watch their next flight disappear from the board. For many African travelers, the Gulf is not the final destination. It is simply the bridge that allows them to reach the rest of the world. When that bridge becomes unstable, the entire journey collapses. Students traveling abroad for education, workers returning to jobs, business travelers heading to meetings, families trying to reunite across continents, all suddenly face the same problem. Their carefully planned routes depend on a system that is now struggling to function. This is why the disruption did not remain local. It expanded outward, touching airlines and passengers across multiple continents. And once the aviation network began absorbing the shock, the scale of the disruption became impossible to ignore. Which leads to the next question. Just how large did the global aviation disruption become within only a few hours? Once the airspace closures and airport disruptions began spreading across West Asia, the aviation system entered a phase that experts often describe as network shock. Aviation may look like thousands of separate flights on a map, but in reality, it functions as a tightly connected web. When one part of that web suddenly breaks, the consequences travel outward much faster than most people realize. Within only a few hours, aviation monitoring platforms began reporting numbers that signaled something unusual was unfolding. More than 2,700 flights were canceled worldwide, and over 12,000 additional flights were delayed as airlines struggled to reorganize their operations. These numbers continued to shift throughout the day as airlines attempted to adapt to rapidly changing conditions in the region. For passengers, the experience was chaotic, but strangely quiet at the same time. At airports across continents, departure boards began filling with delays. Aircraft that should have departed sat motionless at the gates. Ground crews waited for instructions that kept changing. In many terminals, travelers were simply told to remain seated and wait for updates. Behind the scenes, airline operations centers were facing an enormous logistical challenge. Every commercial flight involves a chain of carefully coordinated elements. Aircraft must arrive at the correct airport at the correct time. Crews must remain within legal working hour limits. Fuel loads are calculated based on specific routes. Airport slots are assigned months in advance to prevent congestion. When airspace suddenly becomes unavailable, that entire system must be recalculated. Flights already in the air sometimes had to divert hundreds of kilometers away from their original paths. Others were forced to land at airports that were never part of their planned journey. Aircraft scheduled for later flights could no longer reach the airports where they were supposed to begin their next route. This created a domino effect. One canceled flight means an aircraft is not where it should be for the next flight. That missing aircraft causes another delay, which then pushes back several more departures. Within a few hours, disruptions begin spreading through airline networks across multiple continents. Even airlines operating far from the conflict zone started feeling the pressure. European carriers had to adjust routes that normally cross the Middle East when traveling toward Asia. Asian airlines faced similar challenges when flying to Europe. Cargo flights transporting goods between continents suddenly had to take longer paths around restricted areas. For African travelers, the consequences were particularly visible because so many journeys rely on tightly timed connections through international hubs. When delays begin stacking up, connecting flights quickly disappear. Passengers arriving late from one route find that the aircraft they were supposed to board has already left or has been canceled altogether. Airports that normally run like precise machines suddenly begin to slow down, not because of local problems, but because the global aviation system around them has been shaken. By the time aviation authorities and airlines began assessing the scale of the disruption, it was already clear that this was not a routine disturbance. The numbers pointed towards something much larger. But within that global disruption, one group of airlines faced an especially difficult decision. How did African carriers respond when the routes they depend on suddenly became unpredictable? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. As the disruption spread across global aviation networks, African airlines found themselves facing a difficult calculation. The situation unfolding in West Asia was changing rapidly, and every airline had to decide whether continuing operations in that environment was still safe. For carriers across Africa, the Gulf region is not a distant market. It is one of the most important gateways linking the continent to the wider world. Flights between African capitals and cities in the Gulf operate daily, carrying workers, students, business travelers, and cargo that moves between continents. When airspace conditions began shifting hour by hour, airline operations teams across Africa started reassessing their routes. Safety always comes first in aviation, and airlines cannot allow aircraft to operate near unpredictable military activity. Even if a conflict is not directly targeting airports or passenger planes, the presence of missile systems, military aircraft, and emergency airspace restrictions creates too much uncertainty for commercial flights. Because of that risk, several African airlines began suspending services to affected destinations. Carriers such as Egypt Air, Ethiopian Airlines, and Kenya Airways operate numerous flights connecting African cities with Gulf hubs. These routes are essential parts of their networks, feeding passengers into larger international connections and maintaining economic links between regions. But with airspace closures spreading and airport operations becoming uncertain, continuing those flights could expose aircraft and passengers to unnecessary danger. Suspending a route is not a simple decision for an airline. Each cancellation affects hundreds of passengers who have already purchased tickets. Aircraft that were supposed to operate those routes must suddenly be reassigned or grounded. Crew schedules built weeks in advance must be rewritten overnight. Cargo shipments that depend on those flights, including medical supplies, electronics, and other goods, also face delays. Yet the priority in aviation remains clear. No flight proceeds if the safety environment cannot be guaranteed. As these suspensions began appearing across airline schedules, travelers waiting to depart from African airports quickly noticed the change. Flights to Gulf cities started disappearing from departure boards. Passengers who were expecting to transit through those hubs suddenly had to reconsider their entire travel plans. Some journeys could be rerouted through alternative hubs, but others became impossible to complete until conditions stabilize. For many travelers, this created a confusing situation. Their final destination might still be safe and open, but the path required to reach it had collapsed. At the same time, airports within Africa began dealing with growing numbers of passengers whose flights could no longer depart as scheduled. Airline staff worked to provide updates and alternative routes, but in situations like this, solutions are rarely immediate. realized that many of their citizens were now caught inside a rapidly evolving situation abroad, which raises the next important question. How did African governments react once their citizens began facing sudden travel disruption in the Gulf region? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. As the aviation disruption intensified and flights began disappearing across the region, African governments quickly realized that many of their citizens were now caught in a situation they had not planned for. The Gulf is home to millions of African workers, students, and professionals. Every day, thousands travel through its airports, either returning home, heading to jobs, or continuing their journeys to other continents. When the travel system began breaking down, it meant that large numbers of Africans suddenly found themselves stranded in transit hubs or facing uncertain routes. Governments could not ignore that reality. The first response came in the form of urgent travel advisories. These are official warnings issued by governments to inform citizens about risks and provide guidance on how to move safely during rapidly evolving situations. South Africa was among the first to respond. Authorities there issued immediate advisories to citizens currently in the region, urging them to remain alert, follow official instructions from local authorities, and avoid unnecessary movement through unstable airports. The guidance also included a practical recommendation that caught attention. If flights remain unavailable, travelers should consider using land borders where possible until aviation operations stabilize. This suggestion reflected how unpredictable airport conditions had become. When large aviation hubs begin experiencing operational shutdowns, passengers can sometimes find themselves waiting for days before flights resume. In such cases, crossing into neighboring countries where airports remain functional can become the fastest way to leave a crisis zone. Other African governments soon followed with their own alerts. Authorities in Ghana, Uganda, and Nigeria issued warnings encouraging citizens to closely monitor the situation before attempting to travel through the affected region. Embassies and diplomatic missions began advising travelers to remain in contact with local officials in case assistance becomes necessary. For governments, these advisories serve several purposes at once. First, they provide citizens with reliable information in situations where rumors and confusion can spread quickly. When flights start disappearing from airport boards and schedules change without warning, travelers often turn to official government channels for guidance. Second, advisories help reduce additional pressure on already strained transportation networks. If governments warn citizens to delay travel or avoid certain routes, it can prevent thousands of people from arriving at airports that are already struggling to manage disruptions. Finally, such responses signal that governments are monitoring the situation closely and preparing to assist their citizens if conditions deteriorate further. For Africans living or working abroad, this reassurance matters. Many rely on clear guidance from their home countries when global crises begin affecting travel routes. Knowing that governments are aware of the situation and actively issuing instructions provides a level of stability in an otherwise uncertain environment. But beyond the immediate travel warnings and stranded passengers, this crisis reveals a deeper issue about Africa's position in the global aviation network. Which leads to the final question. What does this disruption reveal about Africa's dependence on international travel corridors outside the continent? As the aviation disruption unfolded and governments began issuing travel advisories, a deeper realization quietly emerged beneath the immediate crisis. The problem was not only the conflict or the flight cancellations. The problem was how much of Africa's global movement depends on air corridors that sit outside the continent itself. For years, the structure of international travel has placed several powerful aviation hubs at the center of global connectivity. Airports in the Gulf grew into enormous transit gateways that link continents together. Passengers traveling from Africa to Europe, Asia, or North America often pass through these hubs before reaching their final destination. It is an efficient system when everything is stable. But moments like this expose its fragility. When instability hits those regions, whether through war, political tension, or sudden airspace closures, the shock spreads instantly across the routes that Africans depend on. Journeys that normally take a few hours to organize suddenly become impossible to operate. airlines must reroute aircraft thousands of kilometers away from closed skies. Some flights become too long to operate with the existing fuel capacity. Others lose access to key connecting airports that normally make long-distance travel possible. This does not just affect passengers trying to move between continents. It also affects trade, business travel, medical supply chains, and cargo networks that rely on the same aviation routes. Goods that move quickly through global air transport can suddenly face delays when aircraft must avoid major transit hubs. In moments like this, the structure of global mobility becomes visible. Africa has made significant progress expanding its own aviation sector over the past 2 decades. Airlines such as Ethiopian Airlines, Egypt Air, and several regional carriers have built strong networks connecting African cities with international destinations. Airports across the continent have also modernized to handle increasing passenger traffic. Yet despite these improvements, many long-distance journeys still depend on external transit hubs to connect Africa with the rest of the world. That reliance works smoothly when geopolitical conditions remain calm. But when events far beyond the continent disrupt those corridors, Africa feels the consequences immediately. Flights cancel, connections vanish. Travelers wait in airports for routes that no longer exist. The crisis unfolding now is therefore more than just a temporary aviation disruption. It is a reminder of how interconnected the world's transportation systems have become, and how quickly shocks in one region can ripple across others. For African travelers watching events unfold today, the situation raises an important reflection about the future. Let us know in the comments section whether Africa can strengthen its own aviation networks so that the continent's global connectivity becomes less vulnerable to disruptions happening far beyond its borders. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.
Deposit Photos Music.